Uh, for those that just missed what I said, please turn off your mics till the end of the interview, and then we will open up for questions. But my name is Stephanie. I am the community manager here at Amazfit. And we are just so excited to get this sports community up and running, and specifically welcome our sports expert, Dr. Matthew Laye, into our community. And today, the purpose of this interview is to not only learn about what he does, his background, his incredible personal achievements, both as an endurance athlete and as a professional, and what he has to offer for this space. So I would like to start off by welcoming Matthew and let him introduce himself. So Dr. Matthew Laye, tell us about who you are, and where you're coming from today, and share what experiences you can bring to the community as we start off this interview.
All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. So a little bit of my background. I loved running growing up. I loved sports growing up. So I've always been a runner. And when I was an undergrad and a runner, I initially majored in biochemistry. And then I quickly asked one of my professors who was in the sort of the gym building, who was an expert on altitude training, whether I should go to altitude for the summer. And he said I should take his class on environmental effects on human performance. And so I took that class, and then it sort of changed my career trajectory. I ended up majoring in exercise biology at UC Davis. And from there, I went to get my PhD at University of Missouri, where mostly we were focused on sort of the health effects of exercise, given that most of the funding from the National Institutes of Health is more related to health and not necessarily performance, but I've always had this sort of background interest in performance. And so since then, done a couple of postdocs where focused mostly on research. I was at a small liberal arts school out here in the Treasure Valley of Idaho. So in Boise, Idaho, I was at the College of Idaho for 6 years, where I was head of the Health and Human Performance Department. And I just recently moved to the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine, where I now teach first and second year medical students physiology. But throughout that time, I've always been interested in performance and exercise, and myself have continued to run. So I progressively there was nothing long enough in college that I was good at. So I had to get longer and longer and longer as after I graduated. So I eventually moved to marathons, eventually moved to ultras. I've run one 100-mile race, and eventually transitioned to actually coach as well. So I've been coaching with Sharman Ultra Coaching for the past 4 or 5 years. And that's been a lot of fun. So I have this sort of experience in research, this experience as an athlete, and this experience as a coach as well.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I'd love to dive into all of what you just brought to the table. I kind of broken down my questions in different sections of athletic achievements and your professional achievements. So I would love to touch on your incredible athletic achievements first, and get a bit of hear your perspective on them and see how they've kind of brought things into what you're doing right now. So you did mention, how you originally found running, but what made you want to take it seriously? Do you have that competitive drive, or was it a wonder? Was it something else? What really got you to drink the Kool-Aid, some might say?
Yeah, so it definitely started in high school. I was mostly a soccer player. And I remember specifically my sophomore year of high school, our soccer team was terrible. The city team was terrible. The school team was terrible. I think we were 2-22 or something, just terrible. And the cross country team, on the other hand, was really good. And I ran cross country that sophomore year, and we were second in state. And I was a contributing member. I was the fourth on the team. And I decided I kind of like this whole winning thing. This thing's kind of fun, and I seem to be pretty good at it. And so I continued along that path, and I had this great high school coach who always would say, running is not a sport, it's a lifestyle. And I think that was what really stuck with me, is just that it's not just it's not just a competitive aspect. It's all the other parts of running that I really enjoy. The traveling to races, the training with friends, the community of like-minded people, the like personal challenges with it. And so I think those are the things that, like, the success maybe got me into it initially, but it's all those other things that sort of have made me stick with it, even though I haven't been able to train for a number of years because of injuries. And but yet I'm still involved in the community.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like you mentioned, there's so much, the 100-mile races are more of an experience, and there's so much that goes into it, such as the travel and the venue. But many people, I'm sure you've gotten the question of, why do people get out and race 100 miles? So my question to you is, during that time when you were racing, I know you mentioned now you're not right now, but what is your why? Like, what is your why of doing that, and how did you use it to propel you forward?
It was peer pressure. It was all the community.
Oh my goodness.
All the people I was running with. This was a time when I was living in Marin County, so just north of San Francisco. And at the time, this running store had really generated this community, San Francisco Running Company. And there was a bunch of people that I was running with there. And a lot of them were having really great success. And they're like, Matt, you should really run 100 miles. You should really try to qualify for Western States. If you can, like, run this one race, you can get a golden ticket and you could compete at Western States with the rest of us and all these other people who are competing. And so it was not more than, I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 4, probably not more than 5 months before the race that I was talked into, like, going out and doing my first 100-miler, and only still, actually. Yeah.
That's incredible. And that's a testament to all the miles you put in prior to that, I'm sure.
Yes, it is. Like, it's not just a 4-month build from scratch. It was 15 years of running consistently previously. Yeah.
I'm sure. So going off of that, this question might not have as much relevance to that race, but as you continue to do these ultra marathons, can you please share about your training, and what methods have you tried over the years, and how did you find what worked for you? And feel free to think outside the box with this question about training and nutrition, or one or the other, whatever stands out for you.
Yeah, I mean, I can link it a little bit to my personal experience, but also like my coaching experience, where I coach, athletes who are anywhere from the front of the pack to just trying to meet the cutoff. And those are two different experiences for those athletes. One is dramatically longer than the other, and it actually requires probably more perseverance and a little bit more stick-to-itness than the athlete who's at the front and competing the race in maybe half the amount of time. So those are the very different experiences. My own personal experience, the main thing I was concerned about was in making that jump is, can your legs actually hold up the whole time? And because what happens so often in these really long races is people's legs, they just break down and they can't run, and they're walking down hills, and you're just bleeding time if you're walking a downhill. That should be the time when it's the easiest on the cardiovascular system. So you should be able to at least run a little bit. And I wanted to make sure that my legs were ready for the pounding that was going to take place over 100 miles. And so I did a few crazy downhill workouts with Ian Sharman, who is the head of the coaching group and also was one of my training partners. And we were also training for the same race. And he was I was learning from him through the process. And we did these like downhill 10Ks and 5Ks super fast on the roads that would just beat up our legs. And after a couple of those spaced 3 or 4 weeks apart, I wasn't sore anymore from them. And my legs held up pretty well during the 100-miler. It was not a super hilly 100-miler, so that's a caveat for sure. But I do think that having that sort of eccentric downhill running to build up leg strength done in properly spaced intervals is really, really important to be able to keep your running legs available to you later in the race. And that's something that a lot of my athletes I try to focus on is is that core specific, but also the downhill running and also just the strength training in general, so that the legs hold up. Because it's not the cardiovascular system that's gonna eventually be the limiting factor. You're not anywhere close to your maximal heart rate for these events. So it's you have the strength in the legs.
That's such an incredible addition, because as somebody, I just personally am signing up for one of my first ultras this year, and that's something I didn't even consider. So someone new to the sport, I'm like thinking about the uphills, and I'm looking at the courses and the elevation, but to consider the downhill. So follow up would be, how did you incorporate strength training, and what strength training exercises made a difference for you in your training?
So I would do things differently now than I did then. Then I did a lot of body weight exercises and sort of lighter weight, maybe like 15 and 20 pounds in each hand, lunges, and just really high repetitions of those. So after runs, I would just go in the parking lot and I'd just do lunges like the entire length of the parking lot and back and forth and back and forth, like a couple times a week. Now I would probably incorporate more heavy traditional lifting, which is really beneficial for all runners, and I think especially ultra runners. So that would be like sort of, squats, some deadlifts, some RDL type exercises for the hamstrings.
Right.
And then also some plyometric stuff as you got a little bit closer. I think that's how you sort of do eccentric loading. And so it's a similar approach to actually skimo athletes often do this sort of workout set. So I'll have athletes do it's like sort of metabolic conditioning where they're doing, say, 15 bodyweight squats, 15 lunges on each side, 15 bodyweight jump squats, and 15 jump lunges, with maybe 30 seconds rest in between, and do like 6 to 8 sets of those, or work up to that amount. And that can be a really, really good way to induce a little bit of eccentric soreness. And as you progress week to week through an 8 or 10 week buildup, you can add a little bit of weight. So you're holding some weight in your hands when you're doing those jump squats and jump lunges. And I found that to be a pretty effective way to get the eccentric loading in for athletes. So one of those sessions, one heavy day, like traditional strength session a week, is a typical, like, ideal for a given athlete, if they can manage that.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure I have more coaching questions for you in a bit. So you trained at, looking back, you would change maybe a few things about your physical training for the events based off of, I'm assuming, would it be current research or your own coaching practices?
It's mostly on my own coaching practices. I think if I had more time to train myself, there'd be a lot of other things I would probably change. I never was very good at the hillier mountainous ultras. That was always an area where I personally struggled a lot. So I think that's an area where I'd try to figure out what I needed to do to be a little bit more effective on those mountainous, hilly, like ultra routes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important, like you mentioned, to have that physical endurance and ability to withstand such a long distance and long period of time, especially pounding on the legs. But I would argue that the same goes for mentally. So I'm wondering, how did you train yourself to have the mental game for these events? And how did you continuously improve your mindset to get better at that, or maybe even bring that into a coaching practice now?
Yeah, I think with mindset, you can focus on, say, internal things or external things. And I'm always trying to focus on internal things. Like, I sort of do this practice that I learned in college, where you sort of have I have this mental dashboard where I'll be running along and I'll just be thinking, all right, how do my legs feel? How does my stomach feel? Do I need to eat? Am I thirsty? What's my pace? And I'll just rotate through these things. And it depends a little bit on where I am in the race. So that's like often an early race, a race tactic where I might just sort of focus through and say, okay, am I not exerting too much effort? Am I in the right level of intensity right now? Am I not going out too hard? Am I paying attention to myself and not people around me? And that's what I might do for the first half, 3/4 of a race. But if I'm really trying to race it, there's going to be a point where I just sort of turn that mental switch and you just start thinking about racing it. And you just start thinking about, okay, where are my competitors? Can I get the next person? How much of a lead do I have? Does my form look good enough, or am I like pretending to look good enough that it might be discouraging to the person behind you? And that's a very specific like performance aspect of the mental training. But with athletes who are just trying to finish a thing, I'm always clear with them. Be prepared. Like, think of all the worst case scenarios that could happen and work through what are you going to do when that happens? What are you going to do when you feel too hot, when you throw up, when your legs are done? Like, what is your response going to be? And have that pre-programmed so you don't burn any mental energy on trying to come up with a solution on the fly. Like, have those solutions sort of pre-programmed. And if it's a really long event and you have a crew, like, tell your crew, I'm going to probably come in at some point and say, I want to quit. This is what you tell me. This is what we do. If there's something in my shoe, you stop me and we change shoes. And so it's being prepared for the worst possible outcome. And then that allows you to sort of deal with it on the fly mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a great answer. And part of me, it thinks in these endurance events, I sometimes think, like, ignorance is bliss, but you don't want to have too much ignorance. And I really love that answer because it really allows you to think about yourself a little bit and reflect and have, that preparation mentally, instead of going the way of like, I don't need any, I'll just figure it out. There's two different people out there, but I love that you shared that. And even, I'm a list maker, so maybe you like, I don't know if you ever have athletes that like write down all the things that could potentially go wrong and like literally write out like, this is what I will do. So I absolutely love that answer.
And with ultras, I think the reason people are sort of drawn to them is it's very much you're going into the unknown. And you have to emphasize that with like your own thinking, is that I'm going to a spot where I can't get to in training. I can't get to mile 96 in training, right? I can't get there. And so I have to be prepared to know that I'm gonna have to mentally be tougher than anything I've done in this training. And with a marathon or less, it's not quite as hard to make that leap mentally. It's like, I've been pretty close to this and I think I can just make that jump. But with some of these really long ultras, it's very hard, especially that first time. And so, I'm like the pessimistic coach who's like, be ready, it's gonna hurt, it's gonna suck, be ready. But also know that if you're in the racing sort of environment, or even if you're just with another runner, it's hurting the same for everyone at that point. It does not matter. Like, everyone is in the same boat. It's tough for everyone. So having that sort of shared sense of suffering can also make it a little bit easier.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that community aspect of races too. So I think that is such a good point. Going off of that, is there, a lesson experience, or maybe even a time you would consider like a failure that comes to mind, and you've brought those lessons into your coaching or your athletic career, or you use it as a reference a lot?
Yeah, I think my biggest failures racing wise probably come from not putting myself out there quite enough, or just being a little bit, I think naive is probably the best word for some of these longer ultras, where I just didn't really know what to expect. And I think that's something I've tried to build into a lot of the coaching and the training that I do myself, is to just put yourself in positions that are going to try to mimic your conditions as much as possible. And it's one thing to see a course and be like, all right, it has 10,000 feet of climbing. It's another thing to go out there and like train for 8,000 feet and realize, dang, I'm gonna have another 2,000 feet after that. And so I think that really trying to train with intention is really important.
Yeah, I love that answer. Great. Thank you for sharing about your running experience. And I would love to kind of use that momentum and ask some questions about your very impressive and interesting professional life. So, you know, let me get this right. I think you majored
There's Stephanie.
Sorry.
Oh, you cut out for just a second.
Oh,
so
okay, am I back? Okay.
Yep, you're back.
Okay. I just kind of wanted to introduce you and correct me if I'm wrong here. So you majored undergrad in exercise biology and then completed a PhD at the University of Missouri in medical physiology and completed 5 years of postdoctoral research on aging, exercise, and overall health. I'm seeing some nods. That's absolutely incredible. So can you please tell us a bit about your research? What did your studies look like? What were the results and how have they impacted the way you do things now?
Man, it's a long time ago. I think I was in grad school from 2004 to 2009 and then postdocs until 2016, 2015. So my PhD work was interested in, we were interested in seeing if we could find the molecular smoking gun for inactivity causing a bunch of chronic diseases. So my PhD advisor, Dr. Frank Booth, is just the largest proponent of physical activity for health. And that was really appealing to me when I was like finding a lab to work in. And we used this model where we had rats running on wheels, and then we would lock the wheels and see what were the first things that happened, like dysfunctionally to these rats, physiologically or molecularly. What happened in the muscle, what happened in the fat tissue, what happened in the liver, like the main sort of metabolic organs. And so we found just rapid accumulation of fat. We found very quick muscle insulin resistance. So even the precursor to what like a pre-diabetic would look like, you can start to see signs of it 48 hours after not exercising. And we also saw major metabolic changes too in the liver as well. And so we had these sort of ideas that there were these triggers, these initial triggers that were causing metabolic dysfunction in animals. We also worked on this huge review paper where we looked at 33 different chronic diseases that are increased with inactivity that we published. That's been cited now like over 1,200 times and with like 400 references. So very much interested in the prevention of chronic diseases. During my postdoc work, in one place we were interested in it was more clinical oriented. And so everybody who came in the door pretty much got a muscle biopsy, a fat biopsy, a DEXA to look at body composition, and an oral glucose tolerance test to look at sort of metabolic health. And we would take those muscle biopsies from these different patient populations and sort of compare whether the sort of intrinsic ability of these muscle stem cells that really have never seen the rest of like what the human was experiencing. They're sort of quiescent. They just sort of sit there quietly. They don't actually do anything until you get them in the culture dish, and they still act diabetic, or they still act obese, or they still act old. So there's some sort of programming that goes on within those cells that's really fascinating. We never really figured out exactly what was going on, but we definitely know that there's something that happens even to these cells that are these muscle stem cells before they become activated due to people's sort of lifestyle that's occurring, that's probably modifying the DNA epigenetically, which is really interesting. We are also interested in how muscle signals to other parts of the body during exercise. So muscle can release a bunch of different factors called myokines, which are these proteins and hormones that can then signal to potentially increase neurogenesis in the brain, fat oxidation in adipose tissue, maybe even angiogenesis and sort of growth of new blood vessels as well. And so the muscle can be sort of the central organ that plays a role in health. My aging research was done at the Buck Institute in Northern California, which is a nonprofit, small standalone institution only interested in the molecular sort of process of aging. And we were interested in dietary restriction and how dietary restriction increases longevity. The model we used was fruit flies, so it's a little bit further from humans than I would have liked. But essentially, we saw that there was all sorts of metabolic reprogramming that happened with dietary restriction that seemed to make a much more coordinated metabolism in overall within the fruit flies that probably contributed to their the longevity effects of dietary restriction, which works in pretty much every organism that it's been tested in to increase longevity.
Wow. And in humans, that would look like fasting is.
It would look like fasting. It would look like specifically caloric restriction. Not that I necessarily recommend it. We had a society of these caloric restriction people that would come to the institute and hold like their meeting at the Buck Institute, and they'd be weighing their food, and they were very irritable and not necessarily happy people just by constricting their food intake all day long. So I prefer the exercise route personally. Yeah, I'm gonna keep eating. Yeah.
That is so fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing about all that research. It's so incredible. And we could sit here for hours and talk about it. I feel like I personally have so many questions, but I would love to dive into, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are you still actively conducting research on the microbiome and metabolism of ultra runners? Is that something you're doing, or did that wrap up? And I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so that was one of those failed experiments. So initially I had collected microbiome samples from ultra runners at Western States, pre and post, but the way it was done was not going to allow us to get a whole lot of information. So that was a few years ago. And then just this past summer, I actually helped with another team that was collecting microbiome samples and a little bit of blood samples as well. And they will probably be pushing out some paper related to that. So I do think that work is coming out, but I'm not really involved with it anymore. So I think that it'll be exciting, and they have a great, like, big team together. I was a team of one, and that was a mistake. I needed more collaborators on that project. So.
Got it. I'm sure it takes a village with research it's this deep and this big. I would love to hear about are you currently doing research, where you are right now, and also, how your past research has informed you to have the success you have, and participate in a coaching business as well.
Yeah. So right now, as I've transitioned from smaller art school to medical school, like, still sort of feeling out what the research is going to be like, whether it's medical education or something else. Mostly I see my role as a facilitator of research experiences for students rather than having my own research agenda. But we have been working, and I do push this research question that I've been interested in is, how do you control postprandial glucose? So after you eat, how do you make sure that glucose doesn't spike massively and comes back down? What is the sort of optimal meal composition? What is the optimal timing of exercise? Because we know exercise is really useful. And is that actually important in the long term for someone's metabolic health, their longevity, whether they get cardiovascular disease or diabetes or something like that. So we've focused on some real basic studies on that, but I do think that is an area that, when the opportunity presents itself, probably jump back into looking at those sort of research questions. And then I am working with one of my colleagues from my first postdoc. We're conducting a meta-analysis on whether or not post-exercise sauna or hot bathing is a useful approach to enhance the exercise adaptations that we see, which is a very interesting area that is kind of counter to what a lot of sports science was doing for a long time, which was ice after you work out, ice after you do stuff. And now we realize, well, ice is great. It prevents inflammation, but the inflammation is actually part of the healing and adaptive process. And so there can be good inflammation that's just sort of normal. And that is actually part of the process that that allows the body to adapt and, say, increase mitochondria, increase the amount of capillaries in muscle, increase the adaptations to exercise. So there's a couple papers that show that to be a beneficial approach from a performance standpoint, and we're trying to combine all the studies to see if there's a overall trend within the literature. And we also just were interested in trying to do a meta-analysis the correct way. And so we've been learning about the process along the way.
Wow, that is so interesting. And I'm sure, sauna is so up and coming. People are all over that. And then the adverse, which is like cryotherapy. So I would love to follow along and hear how that research ends up.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing is clear, there needs to be more research done in that area for any real firm conclusions to be made. But I think there's at least a couple papers that show a benefit, and there's definitely a couple of papers that don't show any beneficial effects. Yeah.
Wow. I do want to dive into audience questions, but I have one question for you as somebody who is very familiar with researching around sports science. What is your take on the new lactic or testing your lactate? I know it's not new, but it's now, popular. So I would love your take on that, and if you have experience around it.
Yeah, it can be expensive. I still don't think it's cheap yet. I know that there are companies trying to make the non-invasive lactate meters that are equivalent to like a CGM or like a wrist-based type approach. But I think that lactate has a real strong place in sort of sports performance. It's not something that I would test personally, because if you test yourself in the lab a few times, you can get the idea of where you're at lactate wise. And for those who aren't really familiar with what lactate is, so lactate is a byproduct of metabolism that occurs when there's not oxygen around. And so people think of lactic acid as like a metabolite that's somehow causing fatigue. And it's not necessarily causing fatigue. It's sort of more of a marker of fatigue. And so as you start to exercise and intensity starts to go up, lactate will also go up. But if you maintain a certain intensity, you can maintain your lactate above a baseline level, and you can maintain that lactate so it stays even. And that's sort of like the goal, is to get it to stay even. Because if you exercise a little more intense and then it starts to go up, and you can't clear it anymore, that's when people start to have fatigue issues and start to sort of fail at the task they're doing. So if you train just under that point over and over and over again, and you can actually measure it, then you'll hopefully raise the amount of work you can do to keep that level of lactate steady, that steady state lactate level. And so I think it's like one of the best physiological markers you can have for training, and you can do a lot more work at that intensity than you can when lactates are really high. And I think that's an important aspect of just the training adaptation, being able to do just a lot of work at that sort of intensity. So yeah, go get yourself your lactate threshold tested in a sports science lab. They'll figure out exactly what speed you're at to keep that right under 4 millimolar or so is where we sort of make the cutoff. And that could be a really great way to figure out the right training pace.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for answering that. I'm super interested in it. I had the privilege of accessing that over break and just was testing it out. And, you realize that, you have to train a lot slower to get faster. And I think that was cool. So to everyone listening, I would highly recommend it. And you'll definitely learn a lot about your training methods and systems.
And you'll eventually get to the point where you can tell from your breathing where you're at. because one of the consequences of that increased lactate is that hydrogen is what I actually teach in med school. One of the things I teach is that hydrogen goes up in your brain and signals these chemoreceptors, chemical receptors, and those tells that we're slightly acidic and we need to breathe more. And you breathe off that CO2 by increasing your respiration. So you can feel that when you're training. You can sort of see where that switch goes from like breathing comfortably to like slightly hyperventilating. And that's like right at your lactate threshold. Yeah.
Super, super cool. Awesome. Well, Dr. Matthew Laye, thank you for, sharing your experience and your research with us. Before we open up to audience questions, I would love if you let everybody know where they can find you. Are you on socials? Where can they find your coaching? Is there a place they can follow your research, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm not taking any more athletes at the moment. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and those are my athletes at the moment. And so I've sort of cut back a little bit on my coaching. I just have a few athletes. I am on Twitter at MJLaye, that's Laye, for my Twitter handle. That's where I'm probably most active on things, although I tend not to be, I'm not super active. But if people want to reach out directly, you can reach out to me at mjlaye at gmail.com, and that's my email address. And I'd be happy to answer questions through that. And then I think I'll be on the Facebook group as well. So, asking questions so that everybody can see the answer is always a great way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. He is in our Facebook group. So if you do have a question, you can tag him, and he will be participating as our sports expert. So that's super exciting. And yeah, I think I today earlier, I found you on Strava. So I gave you the Strava.
Oh, yeah.
He is on Strava, everybody.
I am on Strava, so you can see my terrible training these days.
No, but thank you so much for sharing. And I would love to open up for questions. We'll probably do about 10 minutes of questions. If you look, let's see, where can you raise your hand? Oh, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there's reactions. So anyone out there that has a question, feel free to raise your hand and I would call on you, and you can unmute and ask a question if you have one.
Or the chat.
Yeah, or in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking, feel free to type it in the chat.
Don't worry, I'm used to teaching online, so plenty of experience.
Comfortable silence, definitely. Yeah. Are you teaching remotely now?
No, we teach in person, but it's also hybrid and also recorded. So we have a nice fancy lecture hall, and we have great technicians who help take care of all the AV, which is great.
Lovely.
Yeah, just makes life a lot easier.
All right, we're going once, going twice for questions. If you do have a question,
so I see a question in the chat.
Oh, great, cool. There we go. Go ahead.
So PAI is the physical activity indicator. I think that's what the I
think
I stand for. And that is a thing that it's not something that I've directly been working on with SEP, but it is taken from scientific literature that shows that if you reach a certain PAI, you have a lower risk of chronic diseases. So it fits very much in with like my initial sort of research interest. And it's based on sort of how much time you accumulate at higher intensities of heart rate. And so sort of your zones of heart rate. So one thing to make sure to always do on the, like any device you have, is like make sure your heart rate max is correct when you put it in, because the algorithms or the sort of general recommendations that they use are good general recommendations, but everybody differs a bit. So my heart rate max is probably about 10, 15 beats lower than what it would assign me. So I have to make sure I go in and do that so I get full credit for my low heart rate exercise. Otherwise, it's not going to give you as much sort of intensity credit as it should. So that's one thing I recommend to do that will help make any of the algorithm stuff more accurate, is to put in your actual heart rate max.
That's a great tip. Thank you.
Which anyone wants to know how to do that, but and then Todd asks, is there a resource to find a lactate testing locally? The best places, so some PT clinics will have, so if you have like a place, we have this great place in the Treasure Valley that's like it's like an athletic training with PT and chiropractor and massage, and they have that sort of capacity. Or universities, local universities often have that, and they'll use that as a way to get students hands-on experience and also make a little bit of money for the lab. It typically costs, I don't know if you had to pay or not, Stephanie, but
I did not. My brother-in-law is a triathlon coach, so
yeah, so it's
family discount.
Yeah, it can cost like 80, 100, $150 depending. The strips are not cheap, so they are like normally like $3, $4 a strip, and they could go through 8, 10 strips. It's just going to be a little finger prick or ear prick depending on the facility. And so it's not super cheap, but you can get, I think, a lot of information out of it. So John asked, sprinting is a training method for older men. I love that idea. I am terrified of that idea personally. I think the most important thing when you think about training as like an older athlete is you can't take any steps back, right? You can't put yourself on the shelf and get injured and have to take months off, because you will decondition faster than a younger person. And so the key is, yes, high intensity training is always good for people. Sprinting is going to be higher impact. So I would definitely start on the bike, start on the elliptical, start on something that's non-impact to do the higher intensity stuff. But I certainly think that from a strength perspective, like sprinting can be done, and we should probably all do a little bit more of it. But in infrequent doses, like probably you don't need to do it more than twice a week. Even once a week would be great. Yeah. So heart rate max, how do you get to heart rate max? The best way is to do some sort of hill or incline. That's going to get like the whole body working. And so I would say on a treadmill, get a decent speed and then just start slowly increasing the incline, say every minute or so. And what you want to do is get to the point where you hit a heart rate, you increase the incline, and your heart rate doesn't go up anymore. That means, you're doing more work, right? Your incline's higher, but your heart rate stayed the same. That means you've reached the sort of heart rate max and it's plateaued. It's the same way we would sort of do a VO2 max test in the lab and sort of look for an actual VO2 max. Is you start running a little faster or a little bit steeper and your heart rate doesn't go up anymore. That means you've reached your heart rate max. And it should be done in about 6 to 10 minutes. Like if you're going longer than that, you might not reach your heart rate max because it's too long. Shorter than that, and you probably haven't gotten up all the way to your heart rate max. It can take over 5 minutes to get your heart rate to hit maximal level. Yeah. Let's see. Todd asked about Lumen. I have not played with Lumen yet, the consumer-oriented metabolism device. I understand the principle of it. I kind of fail to understand how useful it will be. Like, I think it's pretty cool, but is it like, for me, I don't think I would change my behavior much based on it. I think it can be decently accurate. I believe it's based on, if you go and do like a resting metabolic test too, as part of which a lot of these places that do lactate testing can do a resting metabolic test by hooking you up to like a oxygen thing, and it'll measure the oxygen concentration, CO2 concentration, and give you an idea of what your resting metabolic rate is, and also what your distribution of fat to carbohydrate is, which is, I think, what Lumen does. So if you're fasting, you should be using more fat. If you're not using that much fat, then you might have some sort of metabolic dysfunction, a lack of metabolic, they call it flexibility. That's what Lumen is trying to do. How well it works and how changeable it is, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. And then MTO, so you asking as you get older, above 50, should you stop doing cardio, running 4 to 5 miles and focus more on strength training? No, you should add strength training. You should add strength training already. I think you should do both. I will admit that as I've gotten older, I'm not 50, but I've really recognized the importance personally for strength training for me to stay healthy. And so it is an emphasis that I make that decision more and more to skip the run and go and do some strength training. So I think it is a prudent idea. And especially because muscle mass is one of the best predictors of longevity as you get older. So maintaining muscle mass is really important as we age. And that's something that I have definitely changed my thinking on from when I was a run all the time, just run athlete in my 20s. I can't believe the GT R2 doesn't have, I mean, it has like everything else. It doesn't have jump rope.
I'm pretty sure the T-Rex and the Falcon, they all have jumping rope. So
yeah,
you know what, maybe I'll bring this to our developer and we'll talk to them about it. But thank you for bringing that up.
yeah.
Awesome. It looks like that's all our questions. And to anyone still listening, if you do have a question later, feel free to drop it in the Facebook group. We would love to get more questions, more conversation going in there. And I will be in there monitoring and always tagging Matt if it's relevant. But again, thank you all for joining us here. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew Laye, for being here in our community. This recording will be available in the community. I will save it and post it there. And we are so honored and happy to have you as our sports expert. So thank you all. And yeah, Dr. Matthew Laye, do you have anything you want to say or anything you have closing statements for anyone?
No, thank you all for tuning in, and yeah, let's keep chatting and keep talking sports science and how we can stay healthy and happy.
Awesome. Well, everyone have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you in the community. Awesome.
Right.
Bye, everyone.